Okay, so overview of the urinary system. As it states, it is going to be very influential in homeostasis and in maintaining the composition of the pH, volume of body fluids, and electrolytes within normal limits. It's also going to remove metabolic wastes. It is going to get rid of substances that are in excess, so there's too much of them, and things like drugs and their toxic metabolites. The kidneys actually excrete about 80% of the different medications that we give for patients. So if a patient has renal failure, it's a really big issue. The portions of the renal system, first of all, we have the kidneys. These are going to filter the blood and form the urine. You have the ureters, which are going to transport the urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder, which is where we store the urine until it's ready to be excreted. And then the urethra, which is going to carry the urine to the outside of the body. On this slide, we can see a diagram of the urinary system. So we'll see the aorta. This would be the vena cava. We'd have the kidneys. The one on the left actually sits a little bit higher than the one on the right. So it's a little bit better protected by the rib cage. And then we can see the ureters going down to the bladder and then the urethra. The one on this side is actually done with a radioactive dye, so we can actually see if there are any issues in the urine production, collection, and excretion through this person's renal system. Okay, so the kidneys, they are reddish brown. They are bean-shaped organs with a smooth surface. Adult kidneys are about 12 centimeters long, 6 centimeters wide, and 3 centimeters thick. It is enclosed in a tough fibrous capsule. When I worked for the organ procurement organization and we actually assisted in the removal of kidneys, none of them seem to look the same. So, some of them might be larger, some of them might be longer, some of them are thicker. We'll see in a few minutes that we're supposed to have one artery, one vein, and one ureter, where a lot of patients had multiple arteries, multiple veins, or multiple ureters. Some of the ureters were functional and connected. Other times you would have one that was functional and a secondary one that actually had a blockage in it at some point. So the location of the kidneys, they are going to be on either side of your vertebral column. They do have a slight depression on the posterior abdominal wall. We consider them to be retroperitoneal, which means that they are behind the peritoneum. The left kidney, like I said, is about 1.5 to 2 centimeters higher than the right kidney, and it's surrounded by a connective tissue called the renal fascia and masses of adipose tissue or renal fat. The purpose of the renal fat is to provide shock absorption. If you get hit in the back or have a car accident, you really don't want to have your kidneys dislodged and damaged, so they do have a lot of fat around them to absorb shock. We can see it here, so this would be the patient's back, this would be the vertebral column, right kidney, left kidney, and the fact that they kind of sit in a depression, and then one's on one side and one's on the other. This is a side view, so you would see the kidney, this would be the end of the rib cage and the beginning of the pelvis. Okay, so the structure. The kidney does have a convex lateral surface, meaning that it is bulging out on the lateral side, and then the inner side has somewhat of a concave surface. We have the renal sinus, which is a hollow chamber in the medial depression. The hilum is going to be the entrance to the renal sinus. So the hilum, remember, is where the blood vessels, any lymphatic tissue, the ureter, and nerves are going to enter and exit from the kidney. The renal pelvis is funnel-shaped sac, superior end of the ureter. This is what's going to collect the fluid together and then send it into the ureters. The major calyces are going to be formed from the minor calyces, which are formed from the collecting ducts, which we would find as part of the nephron. The renal medulla is going to be the inner region of the kidney. It's composed of the renal pyramids. The renal cortex is the outer region of the kidney. The renal columns are what would be considered extensions of the cortex that dip into the medulla. And then the renal capsule is going to be the fibrous capsule around the kidney. In the kidney, the nephrons are your functional unit, each of which is where we are going to filter the blood, create urine, reabsorb anything we need, and then eventually send it down to the bladder. So here we can see the structure. So the darker brown edge that goes around is the renal capsule. Right under it, where all these little red and blue arteries and veins are, this would be the renal cortex. The columns are the little areas that go in between the pyramids, and they are still going to be renal cortex. And then the pyramids, which are these triangular shaped appearing structures, are going to be your renal medulla. Okay. The pyramids they look that way because of the fact that there are a lot of collecting ducts and a lot of the loops of Henle in that area. So all those collecting ducts and loops give it that appearance where it's a lot of lines coming together. So minor calyces would be the first to exit from the pyramids. As they come together, you'd have your major calyces, and then eventually you'd end up in the renal pelvis, which is where the urine would collect. From there, it would go down into the ureter towards the bladder. This would be our renal vein and our renal artery. This is your nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney, and we will cover this in a few minutes. Okay, so kidney structure. Again, we have the vena cava, we've got the aorta, we have the left renal artery. The right renal artery actually runs behind the right renal vein, and then we have the left renal vein. One point of interest is this vein right here. This is the gonadal vein, the left gonadal vein. People who have or develop tumors of the kidney, a lot of times the tumor forms and it'll end up in the renal vein and it'll block this gonadal vein. And so one of the early signs of renal carcinomas and renal cancer is going to be the fact that the gonads, especially in a male, the left one will become extremely large due to all the fluid backing up. This would be the adrenal glands. Okay. Okay, so the renal blood vessels. First of all, we have the renal artery, and that is going to... Okay, so the renal blood vessels, the renal artery is going to enter the kidney through the hilum. As far as this list, you need to know the renal artery. You do not need to know the interlobar artery, the arcuate artery, the cortical radiate artery. You do need to know that the afferent arteriole is going to bring blood to the nephron. The glomerulus is the capillary network where the blood is filtered. The efferent arteriole leaves the glomerulus, and then again, you don't need to know the peritubular capillaries. The same goes for the renal vein. You need to know the renal vein, however, you don't need to know the cortical radiate vein, the arcuate vein, or the interlobar vein. So in this picture, we can see the different blood vessels. This one on the right here, they injected blue plastic into the veins, red plastic into the arteries, and then the yellow plastic is the ureters. So you can see just how many blood vessels there really are in your kidneys. Okay, so blood vessels of the nephrons. Within each nephron, blood flows as follows. It's going to come in through the afferent arteriole. It's going to enter the glomerulus, which are these wonderful brain-looking structures or cauliflower-looking structures. From there, it's going to leave through the efferent arteriole, and then it's going to enter the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta. So again, for the renal blood vessels, you need to know the renal artery. You don't need to know the next three. You need to know the afferent arteriole, the glomerular capillaries, the efferent arteriole, the peritubular capillaries, or vasa recta, we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. You don't need to know the next three, and then you do need to know that all the blood is going to exit via the renal vein. Okay, so as I said, the structure or the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. So each nephron has two parts. The first one being the renal corpuscle. This is composed of the glomerulus, which is the cluster of capillaries that are used to filter blood, which has, again, the afferent arteriole entering and the efferent arteriole leaving, and then the glomerular or Bowman's capsule. This is going to receive the filtrate from the glomerulus. So the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule together are known as the renal corpuscle. The second portion of the nephron is going to be the renal tubule. So this is going to extend from the glomerular capsule to the collecting duct. So filtrate, or the liquid filtered from the blood, is going to proceed from the glomerular capsule into the proximal convoluted tubule, which is often abbreviated as PCT, into the nephron loop or loop of Henle. It does have a descending and ascending limb. Your book will also discuss a thick descending, thin ascending, thick ascending. You don't need to know any of that, just the loop of Henle. And then the distal convoluted tubule. Multiple nephrons will link together at the collecting duct, so they consider the end of the tubule to be the distal convoluted tubule, as the collecting duct is shared by multiple nephrons. Okay, so as we look at the renal corpuscle, we can see that we have the glomerulus being this ball of capillaries. We have the afferent arteriole coming into the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole coming out of the glomerulus, and then we have the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. So as the fluid is squeezed out of the capillaries, it'll enter the capsule, and from there it would go into the tubule, with the proximal convoluted tubule being the first portion. On the right side here we can see more of a molecular view of the glomerulus. We can notice that the red portion would be the capillaries, and then we have these podocytes, pedicles, etc. And what they do is they squeeze the capillaries, creating a higher hydrostatic pressure, forcing the liquid from the capillaries into the capsule. So the function of the podocytes, the pedicles, is to increase hydrostatic pressure and cause actual filtration. Okay, so structure of a nephron. We talked about the efferent arteriole, we talked about the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. From the glomerular capsule, the filtrate, the liquid and solid particles, would enter the proximal convoluted tubule, which is this essentially ball of yarn-looking structure. From the proximal convoluted tubule, it goes into the nephron loop, also known as the loop of Henle. Again, it does talk in your book about the thick descending, thin ascending, and thick ascending, but like I said, you only need to know the loop, okay? From the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop, we're going to go into the distal convoluted tubule. This is where some of your medications take effect, and it's also where a lot of water is reabsorbed between that and the collecting duct, which is not seen here. Okay, so again, proximal convoluted tubule to the nephron loop, to the distal convoluted tubule, and then to the collecting duct. This is a different view of the nephron. They've added the blood vessels now. So we had the efferent arteriole coming out of the glomerulus. Part of it will go and become a peritubular capillary, until it reaches the venous side. The other part will become the vasa recta, which is going to not only absorb some water and solutes, but also secrete some solutes into the tubular fluid. As far as the microscopic view of the kidney, you don't need to know this, so you can cross out slide 18. Okay, so the sequence of the structures involved in the process of urine formation and elimination. So we talked about the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule being the renal corpuscle. We then talked about the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop. Again, you don't need to remember descending and ascending. And then the distal convoluted tubule as the renal tubule. Together, these would be Together, these would make up the nephron overall. So the glomerulus, the glomerular capsule, the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule, and the renal, or all together would make the parts of the nephron. When we add the collecting duct to this, we now have the complete list of structures that would form urine, so urine formation. From the collecting duct, we'd move into the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, and the ureter. So the minor calyx would be multiple collecting ducts coming together to form a pathway. When multiple of the minor calyx come together to form the major calyx, you would then combine the major calyx into the renal pelvis, and then the renal pelvis is going to drain the urine into the ureter. Okay, so the drainage system is composed of minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, and the ureter. After the ureter, we're going to have the urinary bladder, which is going to form a storage function, and then the urethra, which is how we get the urine out of our body. So from the minor calyx to the urethra would be urine excretion. Okay, so at the line between urine formation and urine excretion, once fluid has passed from the collecting duct into the minor calyx, there is absolutely no getting it back. So any solutes, any electrolytes, nutrients, wastes, water, any of that that enters the minor calyx is going to be turned into urine no matter what. Okay, so the cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons, again, this is a slide that you don't need to know. We're not going to differentiate between the two types of nephrons, so you guys can go ahead and cross out slide number 20. Okay, so the juxtaglomerular apparatus, this is going to be the structure that regulates the secretion of renin, and the simplest way to understand renin is going to cause water reabsorption. Okay, so renin is going to go through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. It's going to increase the amounts of aldosterone that are secreted. Aldosterone causes the reabsorption of sodium, and water is going to follow the sodium. Okay, so renin is going to be a hormone that retains water and can decrease filtration. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is composed of the macula densa and the juxtaglomerular cells. However, you just need to know as a whole, the juxtaglomerular apparatus regulates the secretion of renin. Renin is going to lead to decreased filtration. It's going to lead to increased aldosterone secretion, which will cause increased sodium reabsorption and an increase in water reabsorption. Okay, so slide 22, you can cross out. Okay, so glomerular nephritis, we're just briefly going to touch on this. Acute glomerular nephritis is typically due to a bacterial infection, so a type of beta hemolytic streptococcus, meaning that it can break down red blood cells. It typically does not start in the kidney. However, it does form what we call antigen-antibody complexes which are not soluble, meaning they are going to be little solid pieces floating through the blood, and they get deposited in the glomeruli and block the glomeruli, so the fluid cannot be filtered through and cannot be turned into urine. Chronic glomerulonephritis is a progressive disease. As more nephrons are damaged, the kidney function becomes worse. Eventually, it's going to lead to the need for dialysis and or a kidney transplant. Okay, so urine formation. So we have three major processes when it comes to urine formation. We have glomerular filtration, we have tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. So glomerular filtration, we talked about, that is the liquids being squeezed out of the glomerulus into the tubule. Tubular reabsorption is going to be the body and the kidneys trying to reabsorb nutrients and different particles that we don't want to be put into the urine back into the blood supply. And then certain substances or molecules, even though we have filtered some, we want to get rid of even more. So we're able to secrete those molecules directly from the bloodstream into the renal tubule to be turned into urine. Okay, so urine formation if you look at the bottom one, this is probably the best portion of this slide. We see we have the afferent arteriole coming in, glomerular capillaries. Filtration is going to occur here, so we now have a filtered fluid. So tubular reabsorption is going to allow molecules to be reabsorbed into the blood so we don't lose them. And at the same time, tubular secretion allows molecules from the blood to be secreted into the tubule to get rid of them. Okay, so glomerular filtration. This is the first step in urine formation. The substances will move from the blood and the glomerulus into the capsule. It's going to be composed of water, small dissolved molecules, and ions. However, large molecules such as proteins, cells are going to remain in the blood because they're unable to pass through the wall of the capillary. Okay. The fenestrae are the tiny openings in the wall that allow the movement of these substances and water through. And once this liquid has entered the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule, we call it the glomerular filtrate. And this will have the same composition as tissue fluid. Okay, so again, we can see the images related to glomerular filtration. Okay, so filtration pressure. We have two types of pressure in our body. We have hydrostatic. Hydrostatic pressure is going to be the pressure that is pushing outwards because of the amount of water within the vessel. Okay, so if you were to use your garden hose, the force that causes the liquid to come out the end of the hose or to come through a leak would be your hydrostatic pressure. And that in the glomerulus is going to be a force favoring filtration. However, we also have forces that oppose filtration. So just like the capillaries have a hydrostatic pressure, the glomerular capsule has a hydrostatic pressure as well. However, it's typically much, much lower than the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. We also have a glomerular capillary osmotic pressure. So osmotic pressure is a pressure that's pulling inwards. And it's caused typically by sodium, small electrolytes, as well as things like albumin or glucose. So these are going to be more of a pulling pressure. So you would have the three different forces that would make up your net filtration pressure. However, within the glomerulus, it's typically the highest one will be the force favoring filtration, which will lead to the glomerulus being able to filter the urine. Okay, so this is a visual representation of filtration pressure. So you can see we have glomerular hydrostatic pressure pushing outwards, colloid osmotic pressure pulling inwards, capsular hydrostatic pressure pushing inwards, and so the net filtration is going to be outwards. You don't need to know how to calculate these per se, but you do need to know which ones would be favoring filtration and which ones would be opposing filtration. Okay, so glomerular filtration rate. This is going to be directly proportional to the net filtration pressure. And the average adult is going to filter about 125 milliliters a minute or 180 liters a day. So if you think about this, this is our blood being filtered about 60 times a day. Our blood is about 3 liters in as far as volume, so our bodies are able to filter it numerous times every single day. Despite the amount of blood being filtered entering the renal tubule, you'll notice that only about 0.6 to 2.5 liters are produced each day. So we actually excrete a very, very, very small percentage of our the liquid being filtered. Okay, so control of filtration rate. The kidney is able to keep the filtration rate pretty constant through autoregulation. However, there are times when we are able to override this autoregulation. So the mechanisms responsible for keeping the GFR constant, obviously again, autoregulation. If you have an increased sympathetic impulses, this is going to keep the GFR constant when your blood pressure is changing. And it's going to do that by causing the afferent and efferent arterioles to constrict simultaneously. We also have the hormone-like renin-angiotensin system, and then we also have the hormones atrial natriuretic peptide and ventricular natriuretic peptide. BNP we're not going to discuss. However, ANP is released in response to increased stretching of the atria and the heart. So the more the atria and the heart stretch, which would typically mean a higher blood pressure and a higher blood volume, the more ANP is released. ANP would then affect the kidney and cause the release or the increased excretion of water to bring the water volume back under control and the blood pressure back under control. Here's the renin-angiotensin system. So don't worry about where everything is created. However, we need to know that angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 1 by renin. Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme, also known as ACE. And this is going to lead to vasoconstriction, increased aldosterone secretion, increased antidiuretic hormone secretion, and increased thirst. A lot of medications, things like lisinopril, captopril, all those are what we call ACE inhibitors, so they are going to block this movement from angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, thereby reducing blood pressure. Okay, on this slide we can see the relative concentration of different molecules, electrolytes, etc., between the plasma, glomerular filtrate, and urine components. So we'll notice that with things like sodium, you have 142 milliequivalents per liter in the plasma, the same in the filtrate. However, the urine only has about 128, so we're going to be conserving sodium. We notice potassium is about 5 for both plasma glomerular filtrate. However, it's 60 in the urine, meaning we're going to be excreting more um, than what we typically have in our blood. So if we go down to the substance down here, you see we have glucose, plasma is 100, glomerular filtrate's 100, urine's 0. That means that even though we filter 100% of the glucose, none of it is going to end up in the urine. It actually takes a blood sugar of greater than 180 milligrams per deciliter to end up with glucose in your urine. We also see that the plasma urea and the glomerular urea is 26, but in the urine it's 1820. So obviously we're going to put a lot of urea into the urine. We're also going to concentrate the urine, making it so that there's very little water and a lot of solutes in the urine that's excreted. Okay, so tubular reabsorption. Most of this is going to happen in the proximal convoluted tubule, about 70%. So any amino acids, glucose, other molecules that we do not want to end up in the urine, we want to keep those in our body, will be reabsorbed through the proximal convoluted tubule. Tubular secretion is going to be wastes that are in the blood that we really want to get rid of even more. So we will secrete from the peritubular capillaries into the renal tubule. As far as tubular reabsorption, you just need to remember that some substances are going to be reabsorbed through active transport, meaning they need energy. Others are going to be through osmosis, so water reabsorption. And then other things like small proteins are going to be absorbed through endocytosis, where the cell reaches out, it grabs the object and some water, brings it inside the cell, and then sends it on its way back to the bloodstream. Nephrotic syndrome we're not going to discuss, so you can cross out slide 36. Okay, so sodium and water reabsorption. Most of the sodium is going to be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. We don't need to worry about the different positive and negatively charged ions. However, what we want to know is that of the water that's been filtered by the glomerulus that ends up in the renal tubule, it's about 180 liters a day. We are going to reabsorb 178.2 liters of that, meaning that 99% of the liquid moving into the tubule is reabsorbed and only about 1% is excreted. For sodium, about 630 grams are filtered each day. We reabsorb 626.8, which is 99.5%, and we excrete about 3.2 grams in our urine. So we lose about 0.5% of sodium. So even though these two substances, sodium and water, are filtered highly, you create a lot of filtrate with these, almost all of it is reabsorbed. Again, here's just a picture of the reabsorption. You can cross out 38 if you want. If it helps, go ahead and use it. Okay, so tubular secretion. So there's certain substances that we want to move from the plasma into the renal tubule. Most of these are going to be wastes. A lot of them are medications. And most of this is going to be done through active transport. So we're going to actively move it from the blood into the renal tubule. This is the case with things like potassium, different drugs, and certain ions. We also are able to secrete hydrogen ions, which is incredibly important when it comes to maintaining a pH in our blood, which we'll discuss more in chapter 21. Um, Slide 40, just a picture we talked about, so you can use it if you want. If not, just cross it out. Okay, so control of urine concentration and volume. This slide can look kind of imposing with all the different hormones listed. However, there are essentially 4 different hormones that you're going to need for this to know for this chapter. Okay, so aldosterone is number 1. Aldosterone is going to cause the reabsorption of sodium and as a result the reabsorption of water. So this is going to um, reduce urine output and increase the amount of liquids reabsorbed. As far as the cardiac natriuretic peptides, um, again, we're not concerned about BNP. However, ANP is going to be released in increased amounts when the atria are stretched. So we have an increased water level, and it will lead to the excretion of water. We have renin, which is going to act on the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So it'll increase aldosterone secretion, and it'll also have some sympathetic effects. And that is going to lead to water reabsorption. The last one is antidiuretic hormone. This is released from the pituitary gland, and it is going to lead to the reabsorption of water through the distal convoluted tubule, and even more so through the collecting duct. So when your body releases antidiuretic hormone, it will very rapidly reabsorb water that is going through the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. It is blocked by 2 common substances, caffeine and alcohol. So if you drink caffeine or you drink alcohol, it will block the release of antidiuretic hormone, causing the body to create a larger amount of urine than it normally would. Okay, so slide 42 is just a diagram of the effects of antidiuretic hormone on the reabsorption of water. As far as the role of ADH in regulating urine concentration and volume, the hypothalamus is going to regulate or monitor the concentration of osmotic particles like sodium, glucose, etc. in the water. If the osmoreceptors indicate that there is a higher solute level, it is going to send a signal for ADH to be released, which will reabsorb water. However, if the blood seems to be too dilute, it will block the release of ADH and lead to water excretion. We are not going to be talking about countercurrent multipliers, so you can cross out slides 44, 45, 46. Slide 47 is good for review, so please review this for your exam. Okay, so urea and uric acid formation. So urea is the byproduct of amino acid catabolism, which is the breakdown of different proteins, and it will enter the tubule through glomerular filtration, and it will also be partially reabsorbed and partially secreted. Okay, so about 80% of urea is reabsorbed, and about 20% is going to be excreted in the urine. Uric acid is from the breakdown of nucleic acids, which would be genetic material. Most of the uric acid is formed from the breakdown of red meats, so things like steak, and our body is not able to handle uric acid very well, so we do secrete it and try to excrete it. However, even the smallest increase can cause the uric acid to crystallize and form damaging crystals in the small capillaries of joints, leading to what we call gout. So urine concentration It's going to reflect the volumes of water and solutes in our body. So if you have a lot of excess water in the body, we're going to have a higher percentage water than we would of solutes. However, if on the other hand you have a lot of solutes and not a lot of water, you're going to have a higher solute concentration than water. When discussing the composition of urine, about 95% of it is water. It's going to have metabolic wastes like urea, uric acid, and creatinine. And it will also have trace amounts of things like amino acids and other electrolytes. Again, normal urine volume per day is about 0.6 to 2.5 liters, or 50 to 60 milliliters per hour. Renal clearance is going to tell us how much of a certain molecule is cleared or removed from the blood. So this will tell us about kidney efficiency, glomerular damage, progression of renal disease. So renal clearance tests, we could use inulin. This is the best one as it's filtered and it is not secreted or reabsorbed. However, it is time consuming and we're able to essentially get the same results from a creatinine clearance test. So even though a small amount of creatinine is reabsorbed, almost all of it is filtered and not reabsorbed or excreted. So we use the glomerular filtration rate for the glomerular filtration rate creatinine. Okay, so the storage and elimination of urine. So again, the nephrons and collecting ducts will form the urine. It'll pass through the openings in the renal papilla into the minor calyces, the major calyces, the renal pelvis, the ureters, the urinary bladder, the urethra, and then the outside of the body. So your ureters are about 25 centimeters long. They're going to begin at the renal pelvis, and they are going to join the bladder on the inferior surface. They do have 3 layers. We're not overly worried about the layers. And it's important to know that we have peristaltic waves that transport urine along the ureters, almost like we discussed in the GI system and the movement of food through your intestinal system. If there is an obstruction, such as a kidney stone, it will lead to what we call the ureterorenal reflex, which is a very strong peristaltic wave trying to get rid of that blockage, and often it will cause extreme pain and the presence of blood in the urine. Okay, so the cross section of a ureter. Chronic kidney disease. So we talked about chronic glomerulonephritis earlier, but again, chronic kidney disease. So this is going to show, or the signs and symptoms of this would be things like hypertension, proteinuria, which is protein in your urine, hematuria, which would be blood in your urine, dark urine, elevated blood levels of blood urea nitrogen and creatinine, and decreased protein in the blood. It can lead to what we call end-stage renal disease, which again would be where you need to have a kidney transplant or be on dialysis about 3 times a week. Kidney stones, most of us know about kidney stones, so just look this over. Okay, so the urinary bladder, it is hollow. It's distensible, meaning then it will stretch as it receives more fluid. It's going to store the urine, and then it contracts the anterior walls of the, or it contacts, the anterior walls of the uterus and the vagina in the female, and it lies posteriorly against the rectum in the male. At the floor is what we call the trigone. This is going to be formed by the entrance of the 2 ureters into the bladder and where the urethra leaves. It does have 4 layers. The one that we want to remember is the transitional epithelium, which is different in the fact that it allows the bladder to stretch. And then the smooth muscle fibers of the bladder are called the detrusor muscle. The detrusor muscle is going to help put pressure on the bladder to allow for urination. And then the internal urethral sphincter is going to surround the neck of the bladder. Please remember the internal urethral sphincter is controlled autonomically. You do not have conscious control of it. You have conscious control of the external urethral sphincter. So again, just a picture of the position of the bladder in men and women. Okay, so we have a view of the male bladder. So we have the trigone, which is this funny triangular appearance where the ureters come in and the urethra goes out. If we were to flip it around, we can see the seminal vesicles, the vas deferens or ductus deferens, which travels to the testes. You have the prostate gland, the urethra, and then the peritoneum lays on top of the bladder but does not fully surround it. This is just a cross view of the urinary bladder tissue. You don't need to know this, so you can cross it out. Okay, so the urethra. This is going to be a tube that conveys urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. It is lined with a mucous membrane and has a thick layer of longitudinal smooth muscle. It does have a lot of mucus glands called urethral glands. In the female, it's about 4 centimeters long, and it exits anterior to the vaginal opening. In a male, it's about 19.5 centimeters long, and it's used in both urination and reproduction. In the male, it has 3 sections. It has the prostatic urethra, which is where the urethra travels through the prostate, the membranous urethra, and then the spongy urethra, which is in the penis. Okay, so just a cross section through the urethra, and then a look on the right side of the different portions of the male urethra. So micturition is the process or the reflex by which we urinate. So as the bladder gets fuller, it's going to signal stretch receptors, which will travel to the micturition center in the spine. You have parasympathetic impulses that are going to go back to the detrusor muscle and respond by contracting rhythmically. This is what allows your brain to perceive the fact that you need to urinate. Eventually, voluntary contraction of the external urethral sphincter, the voluntary contraction of the external urethral sphincter and the inhibition of micturition will allow you to not urinate. So this is what you're helping to build into the brains of kids who are potty training. Once you decide to urinate, the external urethral sphincter will open. This will allow the internal urethral sphincter to open and the detrusor muscle to contract. It will cause urination, and once the volume has greatly decreased in the bladder, the stretch receptors will no longer be signaled, leading to the parasympathetic impulses stopping, so there won't be any more rhythmic contractions, and your brain will no longer feel like it needs to urinate. This says that the urinary bladder holds about 600 milliliters, and you begin to feel the need to urinate when it gets to about 150. However, if you work in a hospital or a nursing home where people are catheterized often, you'll notice that a lot of times a patient's bladder may have 900 milliliters, 1,000 milliliters, or even more if they're unable to urinate normally. As far as developmental abnormalities, horseshoe kidney is one you need to know, and this is where the kidneys fuse at their poles, which just means their ends. So instead of having 2 separate kidneys, you'd have 2 fused kidneys that look somewhat like a horseshoe. Polycystic kidney disease, this is where the patient gets a lot of different cysts forming in the tubules, in the collecting ducts on the surface of the kidney, and typically leads to the need for a kidney transplant. Renal agenesis is the absence of a kidney. It's actually more common than most people think. And that looks like just about all. Okay, so urinalysis, this is going to give us a lot of clues to health. This is what your lab was going to be on. However, it's important to realize that we can determine a lot about the health of a person through their urine. Okay, so if there's glucose in the urine, it means that they have a blood sugar of at least 180 milligrams per deciliter. There are a lot of harmful disorders that can alter the color, viscosity, and smell of urine. And then there's certain conditions that will cause the change in the smell, viscosity, and coloration without it being harmful. So beechuria is when someone eats beets and the urine turns pink. And then asparagus, when people eat asparagus, a lot of times the urine will become extremely smelly or unpleasant to be around. And then lifespan changes, please go through the list. And as you get older, things don't work as well, etc., so on and so forth. If you have any questions, please let me know. Please get a hold of me. Again, you are responsible for this material for the exam coming up next week, which would be the 5th of January, so January 5th, and the Friday night class will have the exam on chapters 20 and 21. Your chapter 21 lecture video will be out probably tomorrow, which would be Thursday, at the latest Friday. So again, let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully this explained most of what you needed to know.